Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And as you know, we will discuss the results of a recent study of American attitudes towards abortion, links to state policies, shifts in attitudes after the recent Supreme Court decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. And as we start this, let me try and share some slides. See if that works. Share screen. Hopefully people can see those. Someone give me a note just so I know they're up there. Excellent, thank you. All right, so just so you know what you're in for, what we'll do is we'll give you a bit of an overview of our project, and we'll talk about the survey data. We'll discuss national support for abortion, as well as state-level differences in attitudes. We'll talk, as I mentioned, about changes before and after the Dobbs decision. And then finally, we'll talk about links to mental health, right? But before we get to dig in more into these findings, let me just give you a quick introduction of our project, which collected the data that we will discuss today. The name of the project is COVID States Project. The COVID States Project is a large multi-university initiative which has been collecting data about COVID opinions, attitudes, and behaviors of Americans since the beginning of the pandemic. So that's over a couple of years now. We have been conducting these large-scale online non-probability surveys in all 50 states, and in Washington, D.C., we launch a survey wave roughly every 6 weeks. And we have between 20 to about 25,000 respondents per wave. We adjust our results to national and state benchmarks and have collected validated data that we're able to produce really at a fraction of the cost of some national probability surveys. In addition to getting self-reported data, we also collect data from social media as well as online behavioral data through a browser extension that a subset of consenting respondents have installed. So we've looked at health, at social, economic, and political impacts of COVID. We're also tracking a large set of core and emerging issues around public health, around misinformation, around trust in institutions, access inequalities, elections, protests, and many other topics like that. Our project has a couple of main goals. We do academic research, but we also aim to provide near real-time data to help inform policymakers, the media, and the public. And you can find all of our products and insights on covidstates.org. That's our main website. You'll see there, if you go there, which you should, it's recently redesigned, so it's very pretty now. That the COVID States Project has produced almost 90 public-facing reports. We post insights, we post interactives, we post data visualizations, we have online dashboards with downloadable state and national data. We post our media coverage and editorials on the website as well. We have done some work. We have collaborated with the Office of the Surgeon General. We've briefed President Biden's transition team. We've consulted state officials from New Jersey and New York and Massachusetts and Rhode Island and other states that I'm sadly probably forgetting to mention. Let me just say a couple of words about our team. Our lovely team has 7 principal investigators, as well as some amazing postdoctoral researchers, research scientists, graduate and undergraduate students. We have amongst us representatives of the Shorenstein Center, the Harvard Medical School, Northeastern University, Northwestern University, and of course, my personal favorite, Rutgers University. We come from a range of backgrounds, including social science, network science, health, public health, epidemiology, survey research. The people that you see on today's panel include, in order of appearance, Alauna Safarpour, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard and Northeastern University. We have Kristin Lunz Trujillo, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard and Northeastern University. We have Matthew Baum, who's a professor at Harvard University, and you have Roy Perlis, a professor at Harvard Medical School. My name is Katya Ognyanova. I am a faculty member at Rutgers University, and I will be your MC for the day. So without further ado, let me hand this over to Alauna, who is going to talk about the national attitudes regarding abortion. Before I do that, though, let me remind people that throughout this presentation, we encourage you to share any questions you have in the Q&A box. And at the end of the presentation, we'll try to leave plenty of time to address everyone's questions. So as we go along, please post your questions in that Q&A box, and we'll keep an eye on them and respond to them at the end. Yep, so Alauna, floor is yours.
So as Katya mentioned, we're the COVID States Project, but we also study major social and political issues that have emerged over the past 2 years that have important public health implications. So with the preliminary release of the Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe v. Wade, we decided to include questions about support for abortion in our most recent survey. Our most recent survey included over 24,000 respondents and was conducted between June 8th and July 6th, 2022. Next slide, please. And we asked respondents to rate whether they support, oppose, neither support nor oppose, or have no opinion on abortion across 9 different scenarios. And the scenarios we included were those in which staying pregnant could cause the woman to die, when the pregnancy could harm the woman's health, but is unlikely to cause her to die, pregnancies caused by rape, after a fetal heartbeat is detected, after 6 weeks of pregnancy, after fetal viability, in cases of serious fetal health problems or birth defects, if having the child would be a financial burden, or if a woman does not want to be pregnant. Next slide. We also asked respondents to rate how important the issue of abortion is to them. Next slide. Nationally, we found that support for abortion is predictably highest when the life of the pregnant woman is at stake. However, we also see that a large majority also supports abortion when the pregnancy is caused by rape. Pregnancies caused by rape is a reason for obtaining an abortion that is not always covered under current state abortion bans. We also saw that pluralities of Americans support abortion in cases of serious fetal birth defects or heart problems, and for pregnancies that could harm the woman's health, but is unlikely to cause her to die. And again, these are scenarios that are not always covered under state abortion bans. The other scenarios that we asked about received considerably less support than these. Support and opposition are roughly equivalent when the woman does not want to be pregnant, for financial difficulties, and after 6 weeks of pregnancy. Once a fetal heartbeat is detected and after the fetus can survive outside the womb were the 2 scenarios where opposition notably outpaced support, with abortion after fetal viability receiving the greatest opposition of all the scenarios that we asked about. One other important finding to note here is that a very large share of Americans across our scenarios could not give an opinion. They either stated they had no opinion or that they were conflicted. They neither support nor oppose abortion in this scenario. Now, across the 9 scenarios we asked about, roughly 1/3 of Americans don't offer an opinion about abortion. Uncertainty is lowest if staying pregnant could cause the woman to die. 28% of respondents nationally couldn't give an opinion on this scenario. And in pregnancies caused by rape, where 26% of respondents couldn't give an opinion on this scenario. Every other scenario we asked about, between 32 and 35% of respondents were unable to offer an opinion on whether they support or oppose abortion. Next slide. Probably predictably, we saw large partisan divides across the scenarios. Overall, the smallest partisan divides existed on abortion after fetal viability and when the pregnancy could cause the woman to die. The largest partisan divides are when a woman does not want to be pregnant, where we saw a 37 percentage point gap, and for abortions due to financial difficulty, where we saw a similar 36 percentage point gap in support between partisans. Next slide. And in a very sharp departure from polling on abortion attitudes prior to the Supreme Court's ruling in Dobbs, the groups most likely to rate abortion as extremely important are also those that are more likely to hold pro-choice attitudes. So specifically, we saw majorities or pluralities of young women, Hispanic women, ideological liberals, women overall, and Democrats rating abortion as extremely important. Next slide. And of particular note, Democrats in our survey were 12 percentage points more likely than Republicans to rate abortion extremely important. And the gap between liberals and conservatives ideologically is actually even larger. Ideological liberals are 14 percentage points more likely than conservatives to rate abortion as extremely important. Next slide. And although the gender gap on whether Americans support or oppose abortion across the scenarios is relatively small, there's quite a large gender gap when it comes to the importance men and women place on the issue of abortion. So nationally, a 48% plurality of women rated abortion as extremely important, compared to just 31% of men, which is a 17 percentage point gap. Next slide. And as you might expect from the kind of groups who care most about abortion, we saw that among those rating abortion as extremely important, support is higher than the national average across nearly every scenario. So among the largest gaps we observed, those who say abortion is extremely important are 13 percentage points more likely than the national average to support abortion if a woman does not want to be pregnant. Next slide, and I will turn it over to Kristin to discuss some state level differences.
All right, thank you, Alauna. My name is Kristin Lunz Trujillo, and we, as Alauna said, we also looked at state by state differences in abortion attitudes on these different dimensions. And so here we have an example of when we just looked, or we just asked respondents whether or not they support abortions in the case of women not wanting to be pregnant. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of state level differences. So the percent of people in each state supporting this particular case or scenario ranges from 22% to 55%, depending on where you are. And the regional patterns here also crop up, or some regional patterns here also crop up. So in the Northeast and in the West Coast, we see a lot more support, as well as parts of the upper Midwest. And then there's a lot less support in the South in particular, but also up into the Great Plains and into the mountain states. And so again, this response reflects a lot of the other scenarios that Alauna had just talked about with state by state differences in terms of regional differences. Next slide. That said, we not only looked at the state by state breakdowns of support for each of these scenarios, we also compared those different levels of support by state to the actual state level policies as of July 1st, 2022. And so here we have the scenario of percent support in each state for abortion when the woman was raped. And you can see in the map here, there are some labeled states. Those are the states that do not allow exceptions for rape. And as you can see up in the percent support here, there are majorities in every state who support abortion under this scenario. And this is especially, as you can see, it's high even in certain states that have this exemption, particularly in Wisconsin, or excuse me, don't have the exemption, particularly in Wisconsin, Arizona, South Dakota, etc. It's in instances like that in particular that prompt us to sort of question whether this post-Dobbs ruling does actually represent people's stances better if we leave it up to the states. And so we can see that in many cases, in fact, in all cases, it's actually not a good reflection of what the policy stance is here. And I do want to note too, in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, we do have less than 50% support abortion in this particular scenario. However, a lower percentage oppose than support, because when we asked these questions, there are two options for undecided. And so there's still a plurality of people in those states who do support abortion in cases of rape. Next slide. And then just to hone in on this a little bit more, this provides more in-depth look at the percent of people who support, oppose, or in the middle of, somewhere in the middle with the stance, their stances on abortions in the case of rape. And then we also break this down by what type of policy their state has. So ranging anywhere from all abortions are legal, no gestational limits, to in states where abortion is completely prohibited without exceptions for rape or incest. And as you can see, especially when I want to highlight where this arrow is, looking at those states where abortion is prohibited and no exceptions for rape or incest. If we're looking at the percent of people in those states who support abortion in pregnancies caused by rape, 55% in those states support versus 17% oppose. So again, even in those states that have a more conservative abortion policy, there's still there's not a congruence of opinion and policy there. Next. In addition, the impact of the Dobbs on the abortion issue and its representation within the states was not as, or it didn't really matter for those policies that involve term limits. So you can see here, nationally, support for abortion after fetal viability, which is just whether or not the fetus can survive outside the womb or has a reasonable chance to do so. The support for that is pretty low across the United States. However, to begin with, there weren't a lot of states that allow this, just these, I believe, 6 states in Washington, D.C. And this had no impact on representation pre versus post-Dobbs, once again, because there was no change with this decision. Roe v. Wade allowed for states to set term limits. But as you can see, the representation didn't really change in that scenario. Next. Finally, we also looked at the geographic distribution of abortion being an important issue for respondents. So the percent of respondents in each state saying that abortion was an extremely important issue ranged from 33% up to 52%, as you can see. And notably, the state variation for abortion issue importance doesn't follow the patterns found in support for the different scenarios that we just looked at. So the geographic distribution is a little bit different here. Instead, this abortion issue importance tends to be higher in places that are sort of at the ends of the support opposed spectrum. So for instance, we have, if you remember, opposition to abortion is highest in the South. We see there being a lot of states where a lot of people say that it's an important issue. And then the Northeast, which was also very strong in the support abortion camp. That's also has some states with high proportions of people saying that the issue is really extremely important, and also in the mountain states and West Coast there. And so that seems more that issue importance has to do with those sort of extreme ends as well. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Baum, who is going to talk about pre-post-Dobbs abortion attitudes.
Okay, so if I can get the first slide. So we next looked whether the announcement of the Dobbs ruling, which took place on June 24th, affected public support for abortion in those same 9 scenarios that we previously talked about. So as Alauna mentioned, our survey spanned the period from June 8th through July 6th, and the Dobbs ruling came out about 2/3 of the way through the poll. So we had about 16,000 respondents prior to the Dobbs ruling and a little under 8,000 respondents following it. So we're looking at the differences between the pre and the post period. So in this figure, you're looking at what we're calling the net support for abortion, which is the percent support minus the percent opposed for each of the 9 scenarios separately before and after the Dobbs ruling. And what we found is that support for abortion increased to varying degrees across all 9 scenarios after the Dobbs decision was publicly announced. So the increases range from small and statistically significant, as little as 1 percentage point for the scenario in which a woman does not want to be pregnant or after the fetus can survive outside the womb, to a maximum of 5 percentage points for the scenarios in which the pregnancy is caused by the woman being raped, or the fetus is likely to be born with serious health problems or birth defects. If you look at the 2 rightmost columns, when we limit the comparisons to respondents who indicated that abortion was an extremely important issue to them, the pre to post Dobbs changes are somewhat larger, and once again, uniformly move in the direction of higher support for abortion. And here it ranges from a low of 2 percentage points to a high of 8 percentage points, with the largest increase for the scenario where the pregnancy is caused by the woman being raped again, and with the scenario where the fetus is likely to be born with serious health problems or birth defects coming in right behind with a 7-point increase in net support after the Dobbs decision was announced. Can I get the next slide? So 13 US states had so-called trigger laws in place at the time of the Dobbs ruling. These were intended to restrict or prohibit abortion access as soon as Roe v. Wade was overturned, as obviously occurred with the Dobbs ruling. So the 13 states here, the so-called trigger law states are Arkansas, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, Texas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. So we next look at these 13 states to see whether public opinion following the Dobbs announcement shifted toward or away from support for abortion across these 9 scenarios in those places where we know state policy was set to essentially immediately shift towards greater restrictions. And the figure presents, again, net support for abortion under the 9 scenarios before and after the Dobbs ruling, both overall and again, limited to respondents who rate the abortion issue as extremely important. And the results here show that in all 9 scenarios, respondents in states with trigger laws that reduce access to abortion actually became more supportive of abortion rights following the Dobbs ruling. So among folks who rated abortion as extremely important, the pre to post Dobbs shifts are quite a bit larger, with maximum increases in net support of 14 points for protecting the woman's health and 12 points for preventing the woman's death or in pregnancies caused by rape. Once again, every opinion shift moves in the direction of greater support for abortion, even as policy in these states moves in the opposite direction. Next slide, please. I wanted to just zoom in on one key example. So this is the case of Texas, and we picked this example simply because Texas is, well, it's one of the 13 trigger law states, but it's also one of the largest states, so we have a particularly large and robust population sample. So it's useful for us to kind of hone in and look at patterns there. So here, Texas immediately banned nearly all abortions after Dobbs. And in this case, net support for abortion to save the life of the woman increased by 25 percentage points after the Dobbs ruling. So a pretty dramatic change. In most cases, the increases in net support are even larger among respondents for whom abortion is extremely important, reaching as high as 30 percentage point increases following the announcement of the Dobbs ruling, again, in net support, in the case that the fetus was likely to be born with serious health problems or birth defects. Next slide, please. So let me turn finally to the possible implications for the upcoming midterm election. So we asked people in the survey which party they would like to see control the House and the Senate after the 2022 midterms. So these were separate questions. So overall, respondents had a very slight preference for Democrats by 52 to 48%, but the gap was quite a bit larger among respondents for whom abortion is extremely important, ranging from 11 to 11 to 14 percentage points, depending on whether we're looking at the pre or post-Dobbs period and whether we look at the House or the Senate. While the pre to post-Dobbs changes are pretty small, among respondents who rate abortion as extremely important, only 40 to 41% across these conditions said that they prefer that Republicans win either the House or the Senate. And that compares to over half who prefer Republicans among respondents who do not consider abortion to be extremely important. Now, I want to caveat this by saying it's entirely unclear whether this is just a momentary blip brought about by the dramatic shock of the Dobbs ruling. After all, these are respondents who were interviewed right before the ruling and right after the ruling. So it could just be an immediate shock, and so that could fade out over time, or possibly it could portend a longer-term shift in the politics of abortion, which have long, at least since the 1970s, taken the opposite dynamic, with opponents of abortion having, for most of recent history, been much more likely to feel intensely about the issue, as well as to base their votes on it. And at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Roy Perlis to talk about mental health and abortion attitudes. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matt. I want to sort of zoom out a bit and try to provide a little bit of context to end this part of the program. So from the beginning of the COVID States Survey, we have, in addition to the questions that we ask about, obviously about COVID and various political attitudes and current events, we have asked on almost every time we've issued the survey, we've asked the questions that are used to screen for depression in primary care, a scale called the PHQ-9. So participants in the survey answer these 9 questions, and based on the 9 questions, we can identify people who, if they went to their primary care physician and endorsed these symptoms, might be identified as having major depression or at least referred for evaluation. So the way we're using the questions here is not so much to say these people have severity of depression that requires treatment, but more as an overall measure of distress. How poor do people feel? How unwell do people feel, and how distressed do they feel? We've done this throughout the last 2 years. And by comparison, in general, in prior studies before COVID, around 7 or 8% of adults would endorse these symptoms at any given time. And consistently during the last 2 years, we have seen on the order of 25 to more than 30% of adults endorsing these symptoms on our survey in the United States. So what's on your screen now are the results from the March version of our survey, which is the last time we asked all the participants in the survey this question. And what you see is there's a lot of variability from state to state, but on average, about 27% of adults endorse depression of a sufficient severity that, again, if they presented to their primary care doc, they might be referred at least for further evaluation. So I think what this tells us is that the Dobbs decision comes at a time when there's tremendous amount of distress in the country. Obviously not Dobbs per se. There's lots of reasons, most notably COVID, that it's been a very difficult 2+ years for many people, but about 3 to more than 3 times normal rates of depressive symptoms in the US. One other point I would highlight is while there's been a fair amount of discussion about the mental health crisis among children and adolescents, and perhaps more recently in young adults and college age, I think it's important to note this survey encompasses all adults. And while we see higher levels of depression in younger adults than in older adults, it's pretty clear that the mental health crisis, even as of spring and summer 2022, is not limited to children and adolescents. And I think that's an important point to make, again, as we think about the broader context for recent events. If I could have the next slide, please. What I wanted to note just to wrap up is that in our survey in June, we asked nearly 10,000 people these PHQ-9 questions, these depression screening questions. And one of the notable observations was that there was a strong relationship between how strongly people felt about the importance of abortion and the degree of depressive symptoms that we detected. So about a quarter of those who said that that depression was extremely important endorsed depressive symptoms. Only about 20% of those who said somewhat important, and then lower rates among those who felt it was less important. So I think the take home from this is, despite the fact that levels of depression in general have trended down somewhat since their peak, I think they remain quite high, and we need to think about this recent decision in that context. I think I'll hand it back to either Matt or Katya at this point.
Awesome. Thanks, Roy. I was promised that people won't go for over 35 minutes, and I'm astounded to find out that that has actually happened. That is almost never the case. So we'll have plenty of time for questions, which you can put in the Q&A right now. Before we move to the Q&A session, just to remind people again, we have more information about these findings and the specific data points that you're seeing in the slides that you can find if you can go to our website, covidstates.org. You are seeing it on your screens, and I think someone will post it on in the chat for you as well. And you can find our two most recent reports that look at state-by-state views on abortion, as well as the changes in support for abortion pre and post-Dobbs. You can also find an op-ed that Alauna and Matt wrote for the conversation, an article which looks at specifically the implications of our findings for democratic representation. And with that, let's just, and Krisio, apologies, I miss her. She's also an author on the op-ed. With that, let's open the floor for questions. And I will start just taking questions from the Q&A box one by one as they come in, and please feel free to add more. Let me just stop sharing my screen, if I can figure out how to do that. That is always a fun part of event. Alrighty. So the first question we have, I see here, comes from Aijan Usenalieva, who mentions that the issue of abortion legislation is a controversial one, and asks several questions that have to do with people's opinion regarding the risks of public support for abortion legislation and its link to key performance indicators such as gender gap elimination, public health, and women entrepreneurship. So does anyone want to take a stab at the links between abortion legislation and those other key factors?
So I will just say that, the COVID States project is primarily focused on the US. Unfortunately, we're not a cross-country project. I will say that, in terms of American history and what we saw with abortion legalization, which in the United States, which unfortunately also, not unfortunately, but unfortunately from a methodological standpoint, also coincided with increasing access to contraceptives. So that makes it a little hard to tell whether it's necessarily abortion access or access to contraceptions, but it did spur, greater women in the workplace in the United States. Again, to the extent to which that's attributable to abortion access versus access to birth control is a little unclear. But I'd definitely like to see more research on that. And I think we probably will, as we're kind of undergoing a bit of a natural experiment across the US now, with some states prohibiting abortion and others allowing abortion access to move forward. know if anyone else would like to add.
I think the question of the relationship between climate change and its hormonal effects and the implications that were described in this question is a really interesting question. Unfortunately, it's an issue that I can't speak for anybody else, but I certainly don't know anything about it, so I don't know the answer to the question. But it would surprise me if nobody was working on that. But I couldn't say.
Right. So we had also some questions earlier that were more about the medical side of things. So we are more focused in this project on the public opinion side of public health, and so we have a little bit less to say about, say, vaccine effectiveness. And things like that, and more to say about people's perceptions about key public health issues, including abortion. We have a couple of questions from Maya Sen. Matt, this one is for you. On the pre and post-Dobbs questions, what are the differing impacts by party or ideology? For example, are Democrats more likely to increase support for abortion by more and Republicans by less? And what about independents?
So we don't see huge differences in the pre-post-Dobbs reads on support. So there are modest increases among Democrats that are a little bit bigger than among Republicans or independents. But among Republicans and independents, I believe it wasn't even statistically significant. And among Democrats it was, but it's not very large. And sort of paradoxically, we see slight decreases in intent to vote following the Dobbs announcement. I'm not, again, statistically insignificant across most groups and certainly across partisans. But there's, maybe you could spin and interpret this as sort of a disillusionment effect. I don't really know, but we don't see big jumps there. Certainly not, at least not yet.
Right. And then again from Maya, a question about the leak. So in early May, I think the Supreme Court upcoming decision was leaked, Politico leaked it, and Maya is asking whether we had surveys fielded around that time, and whether that impacted our results. We actually fielded a survey before the leak, and then that ended in April, and then this survey that the presentation that you just saw is based on comes from a later point in time, after the leak and around the actual decision. So half of the or a little more than half of the survey, the most recent survey we fielded came before the decision, and then the rest of the survey respondents came after the decision. So we have a pre-post on the decision, and in a sense, we also have pre-post on the leak, in that we have waves that were fielded before the decision was leaked in May, as well as after. We think the leak may have had a little less visibility, or, for most people may have been a little less decisive or stressful than the actual decision. I don't know that we have done a lot of analysis of data pre-post leak, though that is a very interesting question. We could look at some parameters before and after the leak. The issue is that we didn't ask about abortion before the leak. So in our surveys before the political leak about the Supreme Court decision, we didn't actually have those items asking people about their attitudes towards abortion. We also only did that after that was out in the public. So that's one limitation there. Does anyone else want to say something about that one?
No, except that I think that the presence of the leak, to the extent that that was already impacting attitudes, would have led to more conservative estimates when it comes to the pre-post analysis that Matthew Baum was discussing. So I think if we had had measures before the leak and could compare it to after the decision, we probably would have seen even larger shifts.
Right. We have a question from Kathleen Kendall about any information on how respondents compare abortion in importance to other current political issues. I think we're probably going to add this to our current wave that is about to be launched. In our past wave, we did not have a comparative most important problem or kind of comparative issue question. We just had the question about the importance of abortion, but not in comparison with other issues. I think that's a very good point. I know other surveys have looked at that at a national level. We'll probably look at it as well at the state level with the survey wave that is going out right now in a few days. But based on what we have in our most recent survey, we cannot compare abortion to other issues. We actually have that in past surveys, but they're perhaps too far back and do not reflect the current state of events. They're pre-leak, pre-decision, quite far in the rear view. So does anyone else have a comment on that one?
I was just going to mention I did see a Gallup poll, their most important problems question after the Dobbs leak. And I think my recollection is it was somewhere between maybe around 25% mentioned the economy compared to about 10% who mentioned abortion as the most important problem. It actually surprised me that it was quite that big an imbalance, although I would have expected the economy to come out on top. But that's the only data point that I've actually seen lately. In the post-Dobbs period, I should say.
Right. And I think it will be good to see some data as we move a little bit further away from the decision, see as things settle down a bit, because the reaction right after is probably not exactly what we expect to see later on in the context of, say, the 2022 election. We have a question from an attendee that mentions that we might be focusing a lot on the medical procedure, and that might be distracting us from framing the issue in terms of a person's right to choose, and how the Dobbs decision is more, it can impact more than just abortion. And so the question here is, if we frame this not in just in terms of abortion, but in terms of whether people support a woman's right to choose under various scenarios, whether that kind of change in language could potentially shift the results that we're seeing, right? As a messaging strategy or a way to spotlight a different aspect of the issue. So do people have a?
Right. So I guess to get us started with that question, I will just note that we're nonpartisan pollsters, and typically, any group of pollsters involved in nonpartisan polling tends to adopt or strives to adopt question wording that doesn't push respondents one way or another. So the rhetoric around being pro-choice or pro-life, that would be likely to bias our respondents one way or another. So we did focus on just describing what it is we're actually talking about, which is abortion access, and not tried to stay away from any language that might unduly shift our respondents away from what they genuinely think about the issue.
it's quite difficult to have neutral language in this scenario as well. And so what I think Kristin and Alauna ended up suggesting and doing in this case is focusing on language that was relevant to legislation as well. So provided that, given that those are the terms that we see in many states, using the same kind of language that is used in state legislation seemed most relevant in this scenario to understand how people feel not only towards the issue or the decision, but also towards the terms that are encoded in their own state's legislation. So that was another point there.
Just one quick follow-up. I think, as is sort of implicit in this question, we know from 90 years of polling now that question wording matters a lot. And there's no question that depending on the phrasing of the question, you can change the likelihood of getting this or that response to it. And as Katja mentioned, this is a really tough one to choose value neutral language, but the best you can do is stick as close to the actual policy decisions that are being made by the states and ask people about those in the language that's used in the policies. So we would not claim that we have sort of the perfect answer, or that this is, sort of the, kind of ground truth about, what people think about the broader questions of women's autonomy over their bodies, for instance. But it was, we would argue, the best we could do given the topic at hand.
Right. Yeah, but that's a good question about the language of polling around those things. It's as always a challenging one. We have another question from an attendee. That many of the individual circumstances that we have mentioned in the survey are related. So, for example, an abortion that comes later in the pregnancy is also likely to be linked to fetal defects or maternal health concerns. The question is, are there any insights into whether people's opinions supersede one issue or the other? So meaning maybe people who don't support abortion after fetal viability maybe still support it if a woman's life is at risk, which I think we kind of mentioned a little bit, but if someone wants to elaborate on this.
Right. So that's a little bit of a tough one. We didn't ask about these scenarios in combination with one another. That said, we did see the highest share of support for when a woman's life is in danger and the lowest for issues of fetal viability. Now, Chrissy is the expert on those state policies here, so I'm going to let her weigh in. But I believe that in all of the states with bans or near total bans on abortion still grant exceptions for when a woman's life is in danger. And this can happen at late stages in pregnancy, so likely after fetal viability. So, I mean, it's somewhat speculation, but I would think that respondents would, opt for saving one life versus losing two. But that's sort of just a guess. I mean, I think the issue of abortion is very thorny politically and evokes a wide array of moral considerations. So I think to some extent it might have to do with even more detail than I think we could reasonably provide in a survey, such as, well, if you don't provide an abortion, would the fetus survive or would they both die? Considerations like that.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Alauna was saying, the policy, it's a complex issue. The policies are very complex. And then in practice, there's even more complexity. So, right, a lot of these calls that doctors make of, well, how harmful is it going to be to the woman, et cetera, person giving birth, that's got to be a judgment call. So there's a lot of complexity and room for, you know, different combinations of scenarios and what would a person support or not support. I mean, there's just a general correlation. There's going to be a core set of people who are just going to oppose any sort of abortion, and there's a core set of people who are going to support a person's decision to get an abortion. And then there's just a lot of complexity in between in terms of variations. I also think that a lot of people, unless they've directly experienced something relating to some of these different scenarios, or if they're well-versed on the topic, barring those people who are sort of well-informed, I don't think a lot of people go through and really think about, you know, how these different scenarios might work together. It's more sort of holding everything else constant. If we're just talking about this one thing, would I support or oppose it? So my guess is that if we're to, you know, do something where we combined different scenarios into a question, or like, you know, create a more complex scenario in a question, that's like, would you support an abortion, you know, after 20 weeks, but if the woman's life is in danger and maybe something else, I mean, we're going to get a whole different set of responses. So I think capturing that complexity is difficult, though there's definitely going to be variation there. But yeah, that's a great question in terms of how additive or interactive some of these support for these scenarios are.
I will say also that I think it's a pretty good bet that when you bring in sort of multiple sort of conflicting considerations or conflicting scenarios, such as this is like a late term abortion, but it threatens the woman's life or health, we would probably see that share of individuals who can't give an opinion go up. I think that was one of the most surprising things to me personally about this research, was just when you give people the option to say that they're conflicted or that they just really don't have an opinion on this, a very large share of people select that option, which I think is important to keep in mind, regardless of your personal position or your party's position on the issue. There's a very large share of people that just haven't really made up their mind about the issue of abortion.
Right. So it's also, I think, pretty important that given the complexity of the situation, our survey allowed people to either say that they have no opinion or say that they just give them a couple of different ways to say that they either have considered abortion and find it difficult to make a decision one way or another on their support, or else they don't have enough information to make that decision. And some other surveys that you might see out there do not offer options like that. And I think that might be skewing the results by forcing people to actually take a definite opinion on an issue where they're not really prepared to give an answer. So that's a good point. We have, let me see, one more question from Caitlin Kendall. Does our study explore sources of information that the respondents are using to get information on COVID or on abortion? I can start, to say a few things on this one, and people can jump in as well. So we do ask people for the sources of information they use for COVID in our more recent surveys, and usually around election times. We also ask about sources of information about politics and current affairs. We do not specifically ask where people find information about abortion. In terms of health information, COVID information, we see that people still get a lot of what they hear from local news, from interpersonal connections, so their friends and family, network television, social media, right? So about a third of our respondents each get information from local TV, network TV, and their social contacts, and about a quarter of them get information from social media. And then we have, cable TV somewhere in there, a fifth of our respondents, and so on. So we do have some, if you look at our reports, either the ones on news sources or the ones on misinformation usually have some data on where people find their information. You will see some data around that. But we do not specifically look at sources of information with regard to abortion. I don't know if anyone else has additional notes on this question. And I also think this may possibly be the last question we take because we're about at time. So unless anyone, and I don't see any last minute burning question, unless anyone has one in the next 5 seconds, we will just thank you all very much for joining us today and for asking really insightful questions. You know where to find us if you want to reach out. Our website is covidstates.org. You can see all of our reports as well as find our contact info if you want to reach out and connect over those or other questions. So thank you all very much and have a good afternoon.